So I had this interesting relative. He was a great uncle. He served in World War II. He was Native American, and he had this blue guitar, and he would just randomly show up at our house sometimes and play these songs on his blue guitar. And I just remember being a small child and watching him in awe and just thinking, wow, I want to be able to tell stories like you, and I want to be able to do that through guitar. And so I made my parents get me a guitar. I had done piano, and at that point, that was like my focus, and there was a switch there, and it just has always felt right and felt like something that feels like home to me. And then the second part of your question was what drew me to swing music, or?
Yeah, specific type of music that you play.
Yeah, so that is kind of based on my upbringing and my parents sort of being a bit older. So they grew up with the music of the 40s and 50s. So there was a bit of like, well, also the 60s, there was a bit of like doo-wop and early rock and roll, like they would listen to Chuck Berry and Buddy Holly. So I kind of started there, and instead of rebelling forward and, you know, being engaged with music from the 90s and early 2000s when I was a child, I went backwards in time and just was really drawn to the music of the 20s and 30s. And eventually became involved in that type of music through dance as well. So yeah, I just sort of was always drawn to it, and once I began to play it, I just didn't really look back from there.
And it just felt right. Like,
Yeah,
felt
felt right.
I get it.
Oh, that's a good one. Who inspired me artistically? So yeah, great uncle would have been one of them. As far as artists who I look up to, many of them are dead. So I've discovered them through older recordings. And two of the guitar players who really inspired me would be Eddie Lang and Lonnie Johnson. And they were famous for doing like a set, well, also like being like one of the early innovators of jazz guitar and blues guitar, but also they did some records together in the 20s that were technically mixed race records, which was like kind of not the thing to do at that point in time. So I think that's kind of amazing that they were working together and like innovating with each other and like feeding off of each other. And they also just, their guitar styles and the way that they play, like they played really loud acoustically because they had to. Jazz was pretty much an acoustic art form at that point in time, and they were one of the first guitarists that really sort of made the guitar into more of a prominent instrument. So I really look up to them. And then there are a variety of vocalists who really inspire me, like Billie Holiday being one of them, and Dinah Washington. And yeah, those are some of my biggest inspirations. When you think of jazz, let's just say you're asking just a layperson who maybe has just learned a bit about it through their experiences. They might touch on Miles Davis or maybe even bebop if they know a bit more about it, but they might not look all the way back to the origins of jazz. And there is this term that's called like the moldy fix, and it's what sort of like more modern jazz innovators called like the old like jazz guard of like New Orleans traditional players. So it sort of hasn't really been innovated on much, like in my opinion, maybe in the last 50 years or so. I mean, there have been some great artists, like Preservation Hall still continues to hold that vanguard, but they have sort of maybe moved more towards like Cuban influences. So I don't know, it's a genre that I think like hasn't necessarily been innovated on, in my opinion, recently, but there have still been some artists who are actively engaged with it. My creative process is often I'll start listening to an older record or something that I find interesting or inspiring. Maybe the guitar playing is really interesting to me, and I might take an aspect of that and incorporate it. Maybe it's something of a chord progression that I learned, or maybe a vocal inflection that I studied from listening to somebody. So I may take aspects of those and sort of be inspired from them and then write material that was inspired sort of from that. But I often tend to, I don't know if I do this purposely or not, I tend to write, I'm not going to call them man-hating songs, but they're like, for instance, like a lot of the early songs that were from a woman's perspective were very much focused around men. Sometimes they're about just basically romantic relationships or maybe bad relationships that they didn't feel like they could get out of. So I think it's kind of cool to be able to write from like a female perspective that's a bit more like current and like just the sense that like for instance, I have a song that's like talks about just being single, like as a woman, which I think is something that should be talked about. Like that experience should be brought.
Right.
Some of the pluses are that it's, for me personally, it's that I get to live my passion. The minuses, the first one I can think of is that it's not the most stable profession. My work tends to come in waves. Often in the summertime, I'm doing quite well. In the wintertime, I'm looking around, scrounging through the cupboards. And there are instances like, I mean, obviously the pandemic, COVID, has basically nixed my way of earning a living. And there are, again, new ways to engage with that, like with live performances that are streamed. But they, in terms of like financial, they would not make up for what I would gain from performing live in person. So yeah, there's that. And what advice would I give to a younger person who's interested in it? I would say from a practical standpoint, always be engaged and give it 100%. Like practice 6 hours a day, however much time you can dedicate to it, but keep in mind that you may have to work some sort of whatever in the meantime to just kind of support yourself. And eventually, if it gets to a point where your music picks up enough where you can pay your bills from it, you can quit that whatever. And like, if that changes, you can always find a new job to quit. That's my motto.
You can always find a new job to quit.
Yeah, please hire me, employers. Like,
hire me so I can quit you.
I know, right? Probably ruining my future career here in whatever 9 to 5.
We're hiring at Bluenose. We'd love to have you.
Really?
We're a little far away. We would. It's a doozy.
Oh, I mean, there's a couple really dirty blues songs, but I wouldn't say I know all the words to them just because I can't perform them live. Maybe the chicken dance song, like if we're gonna look at it in that way. Like,
I like it. Okay, that's all I got. Thank you so much.
That was really good, yeah.
That's ridiculous.